Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be present with you today. I'm sorry I can't be with you personally due to personal circumstances, but I just want to thank you, Joel Breda, for giving me the opportunity to prepare something and to be with you and trying to deliver the message that I had planned to deliver for the meeting, and mainly is discussing the way to assess the salt intake in populations. I have prepared a short presentation that I'll go through with you from a distance, and I hope you will find it useful for the future. It is only a short presentation, and if you need any further detail on the methodology that needs to be applied, I'm sure Joao will direct you to documents prepared in terms of scientific documents as well as protocols that are part of the WHO library, and I would be more than delighted to answer any questions by email in the near future. Please do ask Joao to pass on to you my links and contacts. So without taking further time, I'll now go through a short presentation with you. I wish you well. I wish you enjoying the meeting and the workshop, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you. The assessment of salt intake in populations is one of the pillars of the new policies for reducing salt intake disseminated by WHO and several international as well as national organizations. The components of the strategy to reduce salt intake are shown in this slide. They mainly belong to three different domains: communication, reformulation, and monitoring, with the continuous research underpinning all three prongs of this approach. In the next few minutes, we will concentrate on one of these pillars, which is the monitoring. The monitoring of a program of salt reduction in populations will involve both the monitoring of population salt intake, which would be the objective of this talk, but also will touch very briefly on how we can monitor the progress of reformulation of foods to achieve a reduced exposure to high salt foods, as well as the monitoring of effectiveness of communication and public awareness campaigns. As you can see for this dual slide, on the left-hand side we have the average measured population salt intake in different countries, indicated by the bars. As you can see that, first of all, the majority of countries tend to have salt intakes above what are the set targets for their own countries, as indicated by the circles. Nowhere in the world at the moment is there any country that has achieved an average salt intake which matches or falls below recommended levels. So you can see this is a daunting task for the years ahead to move towards these recommended targets to promote cardiovascular health in our populations. On the right-hand side, we also have a list of countries, and these are countries around the world, but mostly belonging in this particular case to the WHO Europe region, where there are the several components of strategies from 1 to 5, as you can see, the presence of salt in food, consumer behaviours investigations, an active monitoring and surveillance system, reformulation of foods and education, and the tick represents somehow the ongoing presence of these components in different countries. You can see some countries, like for instance, if we go in the middle line, Ireland or further down UK, do tick all these different aspects, and other countries, like for instance Germany or Georgia, who lag behind in any initiative to try and reduce the salt intake in their populations. But how can we just measure how much sodium we consume. And where is the salt coming from? We're trying to address a few issues in the next few slides. We have different ways to assess salt or sodium intake in populations. Remember that sodium is the component of sodium chloride, which is commonly known as salt. And for the next slides, you can see some alternation between these two terminologies. Just to remind you that 1 gram of sodium is equivalent to 2.5 grams of salt. Now, we can have estimate salt in two different ways, basically by assessing dietary intake of salt through questionnaires, dietary surveys or nutritional surveys, or by measuring urinary sodium excretion, which is a useful and gold standard biomarker of the amount of salt we consume. In fact, the majority of salt we eat is excreted in the urine as sodium in the following 24 hours, with in excess of 95% of it. And despite a between days variability within an individual, the between individuals variability is much less, indicating that although there varies a lot between days in each of us, is pretty constant within the population. We can have duplicate diets. Many of you have been involved in the past in dietary surveys using any of those items like food frequency questionnaires, 7-day weight records, food diaries, 24-hour recalls. Now, all those methods require that there are updated food composition tables within countries where salt and sodium content is up to date. Now, I remind you that about roughly 75% of the salt we eat comes from processed food, with the remainder coming from added salt to food by the consumer, what we refer to as discretionary salt, whilst we cook, or added to food with our salt cellar. And only a minute part, less than 10%, would come from the direct natural content of food in sodium. So there is a shortcoming between the dietary surveys and the actual intake, in as much as, first, they are generally an underestimate of the total intake because they don't take into account the discretionary additional salt to food by the consumers, and secondly, depend very heavily on updated food composition tables, which for sodium or salt have been lacking over the years, and given now the trend in rapid and constant reformulation of foods and the global distribution of foods may require continuous updates, therefore making this a pitfall within the assessment of salt intake. So urinary collection with measurements of sodium remains the gold standard. And although the gold standard remains a 24-hour urine collections, there have been other ways in which people have tried to address the issue, using a spot or casual urine or using overnight urines. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side, the first thing to say that dietary assessments, as we predicted, would underestimate the amount of sodium we eat. And as you can see by age groups, the underestimate would vary according to age groups. That would introduce definitely the risk of a bias in assessing the population salt intake. When we come to urinary collection, we'll discuss later on what are the different options for us. The assessment of population salt intake, as we said, underpins the implementation of salt reduction policies. I told you that in steady state, most of the sodium we eat is excreted through the urine in 24 hours, so that the 24-hour excretion of sodium in our urine represents a gold standard for measuring both individual salt intake as well as salt intake in populations. However, in large population studies, you would imagine 24-hour urine collections may put some burden onto the practicalities, and they've been deemed very often inconvenient, so that a lot of alternative methods have been sought and suggested to replace 24-hour urine collections. That would include spot and time urine. And I had to anticipate that their reliability and reproducibility often has been very disappointing. Time urine collections may have a less burden for participants, they're easier to comply with, they're more variable at individual level, but they may give a good estimate of a group mean. Could be a desirable alternative for monitoring the programs, but it would need a necessary validation, and as I mentioned to you, at least 3 different validations have been published recently, all of them implying the risk of significant bias and lack of reproducibility that prevent us to be confident to suggest them to replace 24-hour urine collections. In order to assess the totality of the salt intake, however, even if you do a spot urine, you will never have the totality, but you will have to need to rely on the baseline 24-hour urine, or you'll have to extrapolate, and these methods of extrapolations and modelling are insufficient at the moment. I would say that the use of 24-hour urine collections in particularly is being considered adding value to ongoing programs already in populations around the world for monitoring iodine intake and iodine status, which again, like sodium, would benefit from 24-hour urine collections of iodine rather than urinary concentrations based on timed collections. Spot urine as well as time urines also provide less burden to participants and are less desirable than timed urine because the further complications of a single casual spot urine, they will be highly dependent on the hydration of the individual, so the volume produced and the residual bladder volume that may remain. It's currently used for monitoring iodine in children and women of childbearing age. And it is a concern that these pitfalls that we apply to sodium might as well apply to estimates of iodine consumption. And finally, you will see probably overnight urine collections being used, but they may give again biased estimates of sodium excretion, and they are undesirable for monitoring program and effects over time. So, the 24-hour collections remain the gold standard method to measure sodium intake. They'll capture more than 90% of the sodium eaten, might have some high participation burden, and introduces the problem of assessing the completeness of such a collection, so that supervision is necessary at the beginning and at the end of the collection, in addition to proper instructions and supervision. As I say, the measurement of sodium intake is, for individuals, is further complicated by the high ratio between the within individual to between individuals variability. In other words, as you can see in this slide, in the red curve, the spread of variation within yourself or myself between days is much larger than the difference that would be between you and me in the same population. And that would reduce the reliability of assessing an individual's salt intake by requiring several urine collections to characterize an individual's intake. However, our objectives in population monitoring is to assess group means, and it is important to appreciate that these pitfalls may not apply directly, or there will be a different relationship when we're trying to identify group means and changes in group means over time during a program of salt reduction. In practice, what do we need? How big would it be a population to assess a population salt intake? We've done a lot of studies and work in the past few years with WHO, and we've come up to the conclusion that to have a reliable estimate of a group population mean, we'll have to consider several things. The determinants of how many people we need to sample to have a reliable estimate will depend on the precision, on the representativeness of the sample, on the variability within and between subjects, the feasibility, the costs, and also on the ability to obtain complete urines. A random sample would be advisable. However, I think more recently it has become apparent that random plus voluntary or self-selected samples will not add much variation to the average estimates of groups. When we refer to groups, I refer to any particular group we are interested in when comparing. So if you want to do a survey for men and women, each group will have to be seen as an individual group for men and women. And if you want age groups, you have to multiply that. So for every single stratum you are interested in, a minimum number of 200 participants will give an 80% power to detect a 10 millimoles difference in sodium intake with a standard deviation of 50. Now, later on I'll show you, and you will find in some of the protocols in the WHO library, a table that will guide you to assess what is the best likely sample you can get given the power you want and the limit you want to detect and the standard deviation of your population, so you can be able to appreciate and recalibrate your sample size on the basis of your local needs. The samples, as I said, refers to each group of interest and considers an attrition rate of 50%. We would suggest to invite 400 people per group in order to obtain 200. If you had resources enough to perhaps do 2 repeated urine collections consecutively across 2 days, you would reduce your standard deviation. You will allow for some regression dilution bias, so you might be able to gain a reduced sample size for the same power. This graph represents schematically the table I provide in the protocol of operations in the WHO library, and that plots the variation in sample sizes across different levels of variability of measures given by the standard deviation and across different levels of differences you want to pick up. The larger the difference you want to pick up, the less numbers you need, and of course the smaller the standard deviation, the smaller will be the sample size. In practice, we will use plastic urine bottles, and here just reporting some of the ones commonly used with a sort of price, per unit price. Remember, some of these bottles could be reused if properly washed and disinfected. Do we need to use any preservatives in the bottles? The answer is the best preservative for sodium, potassium and creatinine measurements is refrigeration of 4 degrees. And that will be enough with an ordinary fridge. However, in hot climates where you might not be able to maintain refrigeration throughout the time of collection or because of delay in delivering the collection, we tend to use preservatives like thymol, for instance, which is a substance that stops bacterial growth, but definitely will not affect the measures. Do not use hydrochloric acid because that would not be a good preservative to measure creatinine, which is a key measure alongside sodium and potassium. Next slide, finally, addresses the concept of feasibility. And I just want to highlight to you my personal experience, which is the one of many others in the field, where over the years we've carried out a variety of studies collecting 24-hour samples from both patients, you can see in the top clinical-based studies, and also population-based studies carried out in different settings, from European settings to also lower middle-income countries like Ghana, a variety of numbers, men and women of different age groups, including children, and with average sodium intakes listed in the last but one column. And on the right-hand side, I just want to show you the response rate of the yield, the response rate of collections in the sample. There is some variations, and there are reasons that can explain the variation, particularly in the study using UK, Belgium and Italy. But by and large, response rates varied between 60 and 100%. And I have to say that this is the best answer to those that claim that it's not feasible to do 24-hour urine collections in populations. So I hope I have given you a very, very brief account on what are the issues and the both scientifically and practical on how to assess population salt intake for monitoring the surveillance of national programs, and I will leave you with the discussion, and I look forward to receiving your comments. Thank you very much for listening.